You're listening to The Murder in My Family, brought to you by AbJack Entertainment. Be sure to check out some of the other great true crime podcasts from this network, including Missing Persons, DNA ID, Scene of the Crime, Zodiac Speaking,
Beyond Bizarre True Crime,
Citizen Detective,
and Campus Killings.
All of these podcasts are available for you to binge on right now, wherever you listen to podcasts. Subscribe where you're listening to this podcast so you don't miss an episode.
The views and opinions expressed by guests on this podcast do not necessarily represent those of the podcast, its host, or sponsors. If you would like to discuss the murder in your family on this podcast, please be sure to visit themurderinmyfamily.com for more information. This episode may contain unsettling material or subject matter. Listener discretion is advised.
Thank you for joining me for this episode of The Murder in My Family. I'm your host, Mike Morford. In this episode, we'll be discussing the case of a hard-working father and grandfather who, despite being in his late 70s, continued working as a security guard to provide for his family. His life was cut short in a tragic act of violence, and his loss has left holes in the hearts of his family. We'll dive into this case after some quick housekeeping. Independent podcasts like this one depend on word of mouth to bring in new listeners. So if you find that you enjoy this show, please take a moment to rate and review it wherever you listen to your podcast. And be sure to introduce a friend to the show and invite them to listen. With your help, The Murder in My Family can continue to grow and reach a new audience. To learn more about the show or the cases we discuss, please visit themurderinmyfamily.com. You can also find us on Twitter with the handle @MurderMyFam or on Facebook at facebook.com/TMIMF podcast. If you'd like to support The Murder in My Family and get VIP access to things like ad-free listening, early preview episodes, and bonus content of not only this show, but for every other podcast on the AbJack network of indie podcasts, consider subscribing to the show with an AbJack Insider subscription through Apple Podcast. For only $4.99 a month or $49.99 a year, you'll unlock a variety of listener benefits, and you'll be supporting the show in the process. Your support is greatly appreciated. And thank you to all of the supporters that generously donate to help keep the show growing and improving. One last note. Please support any of the sponsors that you hear on The Murder in My Family, the way that those sponsors support the show. It's with our sponsor support that this show can go on and continue to provide a platform to share these stories with you in every episode. Thank you. And now on with the show. Darrell William Holderman was born on July 18, 1943, in Middletown, Ohio, to Arthur and Mildred Holderman. He had several siblings. He attended high school at Johnsville, New Lebanon High School in New Lebanon, Ohio. After high school, like many young men his age, Darrell joined the Marines and served in the Vietnam War. He served his country proudly and honorably for 6 years. While in the service, Darrell gained training in the security field, which he would call on much later in life. After his military service was over, Darrell took work in the food management industry, and he was married a few times. He had one daughter, Nikki, who is my guest in this episode, and 3 grandchildren who he adored. Darrell was a religious man who always had his Bible close by, and he was a hard worker and dedicated family man. And as he got older, instead of slowing down like many people do when they hit a certain age, Darrell continued to keep busy working to earn a living, despite walking with a cane and losing his vision. Because Darrell was so outgoing and active, his friends gave him the monikers Macho Man and Cowboy. It was very important for him to help provide a good home for his family. Darrell took a job in the security industry, working in that field for 6 years. He worked for a company called Merchant Security. Part of Darrell's job required him to escort and guard prisoners, and sometimes for protection he carried a sidearm. Although he guarded prisoners, he never had any serious altercations or run-ins with any of them. But unfortunately, that would change on June 1st, 2022. On that day, 78-year-old Darrell Holderman went to work at Miami Valley Hospital in Dayton, Ohio, where Merchant Security Services had a contract with the Montgomery County Sheriff's Office to guard inmates at hospitals in the county. He wasn't scheduled to work, but being the go-getter he was, he wanted to pick up the extra shift. This day would be Darrell's last shift because of an inmate named Brian Booth. 30-year-old Booth was brought into the emergency department at Miami Valley Hospital that same day. He had been arrested on a parole violation related to a burglary in 2015, and while at the Montgomery County Jail, he started to detox and got very sick. Dayton Police Major Brian Johns explained to WLWT News 5 that as a general rule, inmates are handcuffed at all times at the hospital, but sometimes that has changed depending on what kind of medical procedure is taking place. On this fateful day, Darrell Holderman would be in charge of guarding Brian Booth in Booth's private room. Somehow, Booth got out of his restraints and was acting very erratically, and he attacked Darrell, who at age 78 was really no match physically for a 30-year-old coming down from drugs. They struggled, and Darrell suffered cuts to his hands as he tried to defend himself, and his skull was fractured in multiple places during the scuffle. Booth was able to take Darrell's gun from him, and callously and coldly shot Darrell in the back of the neck. Booth then ran through the hospital hallways, pointing the gun wildly at those he passed. When he got to the hospital's parking lot, he turned the gun on himself and took his own life. Major Johns later told WDLN News of the attack. He's facing a probation violation for burglary, which isn't a violent offense, so we don't know why he chose to do what he did. Sadly, Darrell Holderman would not survive his injuries. Details of the shooting made its way out to various news outlets, but didn't mention the name of the security guard. Darrell's daughter, Nikki, heard about the shooting, but she had no idea that the victim was her own father. She hoped that since police or the security company hadn't called her, that Darrell was safe, but sadly that wasn't the case, and eventually she was contacted with the news that the beloved 78-year-old father and grandfather, the rock of the family, was gone. The news was devastating for Nikki and her children. Nikki wrote on Facebook of the shooting, "Today our world shattered. Our hearts were broken. You were taken away from us in a way I never dreamt possible. You weren't even supposed to be there today. I can only pray you didn't suffer in your last moments." Darrell's employer, Merchant Security, released a statement saying, "It's with a heavy heart that Merchant Security must share that we have lost one of our dearest and most dedicated officers today. Our hearts are broken for our friend and coworker and his family." But Nikki was sad and surprised to hear that it seemed like the security company was trying to cast blame on Darrell, perhaps indicating that his age and physical decline was to blame for the tragedy. They seemed to be pointing to an April 29, 2022 incident at the hospital that led some to lose faith in Darrell's ability to safely perform his job. That day, he escorted an inmate to the bathroom in one of the hospital rooms and then turned around, only to think that he saw the same inmate out in the hallway. He hurried over to the man and asked him his name and which room he was in, and when the patient turned around, Darrell realized it wasn't the inmate he was guarding after all. He quickly got back to his post outside the bathroom, and the inmate that he was guarding was still inside. A patient care technician witnessed the incident and reported it to Sergeant Dalton Bybee in the Department of Safety, and he was told by this witness that Darrell had approached the wrong person. His cane in his left hand, and his right hand was near his duty weapon. In an email regarding the incident, Merchant Security General Manager Nathan Birchfield noted that it was clear that Darrell was getting up in his age and said it's time to start backing him down. It was a tough decision to make. Darrell wasn't slacking and he hadn't done anything wrong. But of the incident, Birchfield said, "He's such a hard worker, but unfortunately his age and health are catching up to him." When Sergeant Bybee spoke to Darrell about the mishap, he asked him for the number of his supervisor, but Darrell couldn't see the contacts in his cell phone well enough to find it. It was agreed by those in charge at Merchants that it was time to replace Darrell. Major Matt Haynes claimed that the sheriff's office had officially requested that Merchants no longer assign Darrell to guard inmates because they had concerns about his fitness for duty. Despite that apparent concern, on June 1st, when inmate Booth was brought into Miami Valley Hospital in the throes of detox, Darrell Holderman was the one assigned to guard him. As I mentioned, Darrell wasn't originally scheduled for that shift, but he was allowed to pick it up. Booth wasn't designated as a high-risk prisoner due to his nonviolent crime history, so it may have seemed that it would be no big deal for him to work that shift. Perhaps it would have been a tough conversation to basically force a nice guy who was dedicated to the company out of a job, but the conversation that ultimately occurred after Darrell was killed is so much worse than that retirement talk ever could have been. Despite being a month shy of his 79th birthday when he died, Darrell was a proud man who was always on the move. He would tell his family often that he wasn't going to slow down and he wanted to keep working to give his family the best life he could. Darrell died the way he lived, as a hard-working and dedicated family man. Over a year later, His devastating loss is still being felt by his family. Darrell's only child, Nikki, joined me to discuss her father's tragic case and how his loss has affected her and her children. That conversation is coming up in just a moment. Hi, listeners. I want to tell you about today's sponsor, EarnIn. Financial anxiety, anyone? Worrying about it doesn't help. EarnIn does. Most of us have been there, trying to stretch your earnings until the next payday to buy groceries or pay a bill. But sometimes that's tough to do. Life doesn't happen bi-weekly, so why should payday? The money you earn can be in your hands today with EarnIn. EarnIn is an app that's helping millions of Americans to feel self-sufficient without falling into debt traps. It gives you access to your pay as you work, up to $100 per day or up to $750 per pay period. Maybe your rent is due, or you have an unexpected expense like an appliance breakdown, or you need a tank of gas for a road trip. Whatever the reason, EarnIn has you covered. Download EarnIn today, spelled EARNIN, in the Google Play or Apple App Store. When you download the EarnIn app, type My Family under podcast when you sign up. It'll really help the show. Once again, type in My Family under podcast. Subject to your available earnings, location, daily max, and pay period max. See earnin.com/TOS for details. EarnIn is a financial technology company, not a bank. Bank products are issued by Evolve Bank and Trust, member FDIC. Hi, Nikki. I want to thank you for coming on to talk about your father Darrell's case with us.
Thank you for having me.
The story that happened to your dad is very tragic, and some of the details I read about it, there's no real justice here. It was unfortunate what happened, and as we'll get into, he was killed in the line of his job and on a day where he wasn't even supposed to be there. Before we get into what happened, that tragedy, and then the aftermath, can you tell us a little bit about your dad himself, his life, and what he was like?
Absolutely. He was a Marine. He served in the Vietnam War, and he was so proud of that. He didn't talk a lot about his time doing service or whatever, but he was proud of his country, ready to defend, and he was really big in like his faith, and he was such a dedicated family man. Family meant everything to him. I pretty much lived with him my entire life. Tried to just the bond that we had. My kids and I lived with him as well. And back in 2018, he had purchased a home for us in Carlisle, and he was so proud of it. And it was his biggest accomplishment. He worked so hard to be able to do this for not just him, but my kids and I. He wanted a safe place for us to grow up in and to build memories and to grow in. And he surprised us with it. So I'll never forget that day. He was just so proud and so happy. And he just worked so hard to be able to do this. And he was a very, very hardworking man. He was very dedicated to his job. He took it seriously. And he was considered the go-to man because he never really said no. He was always picking up extra shifts, things like that. But he was just really dedicated to family and his job pretty much, and his faith.
So he's got this family-oriented background. He sounds like he's, pretty close with everyone. He's got this home that he's sort of included everybody in and working hard. And he's, here he is in his late 70s working still, which, I think, I'm thinking of my grandfather who worked, well into that age range. It's, most people picture, retiring young and then living out your final years, relaxing someplace. But a lot of, especially old school men like your dad, like my grandfather, from the sounds of, they like to work, and obviously they have bills too. They want to earn the money, but they're not afraid to work, and they seem to like working, and it keeps them busy. Was that the case with your dad?
Oh, absolutely. I don't think we could have slowed him down even if we wanted to.
Yeah. So, and he was working for the security company. How long had he been working for this company?
I believe he was going on his 6th year.
Okay. And I just wanted to recap, how long had he been in the Marines and into security? Did he do anything in between, or did this something he started doing right after he got out of the Marines?
After the Marines, he pretty much went into like food business, management, hospitality, just a lot of management positions in different places. And then he finally settled down with the security company.
Okay. Now, in that role as security, you mentioned he had been there quite a while. Um, had there ever been any encounters, any problems with any prisoners that he came in contact with? Was there any time, that he got into things physically? Because, you know, it's one thing to be in the 70s and want to be working, but at the same time, if he has to get into like a physical thing with prisoners, that's not something you want to see. Did he ever have any problems or physical altercations with any prisoners?
Not physical. There was, I guess, an incident in April of last year, um, which sparked the whole thing between the sheriff's department and the security company, where they were questioning whether or not he was capable to do prisoner watch anymore.
And can you talk a little bit about that situation and what exactly happened?
I guess he was doing another prisoner watch back in April at the hospital, and that prisoner had gotten up to go to the bathroom, and obviously he had to escort him. So while the prisoner was in the bathroom, I guess he turned his back to the bathroom and called his supervisor to check in. And I guess when he ended that phone call, he had seen a patient walking, and I guess he thought it was his prisoner. So he walked up to him, and he had a cane. And whenever he did prisoner watch, he had his gun with him. He was an armed security guard, and he kind of had his hand by that and approached the patient. And that's when he realized that it wasn't his patient, the prisoner. Um, I guess there was a safety manager from the hospital came down, had to make a report about it for the confusion of the patient versus the prisoner, because I guess the prisoner was still actually in the bathroom. And a report was made over that. And they said that my dad said that he wasn't able to see his supervisor's number, and asked the hospital safety supervisor management person if he could find his supervisor's number, which makes no sense to me if he just called and checked in with his supervisor. But that's just what we found through public records. And that's when the sheriff's department emailed merchants, and there was discussion, or the security company, and there was a discussion on, he's really not capable of doing prisoner watch anymore due to his age and things like that. And the security company replied that they agreed, and that it was going to be really hard to tell somebody that they're going to have to pretty much slow him down, cut him back type situation. But I don't think he was ever told.
And that's a tough thing to do, to tell someone like an older man that's been working his whole life that, maybe he's not up to that task anymore to have that job. I remember my grandfather as an example, when, for example, he couldn't drive to work anymore because we couldn't trust him to get behind the car, and we had to tell him that he couldn't work anymore. And then eventually we had to take his keys, and that's tough to do to someone, and take that freedom away from them. And especially when they're proud and they've worked their whole lives. So I can understand how tough that would be. What was your communication like with your dad? What was he saying? Did he have any inkling that they were going to want to replace him? Did he even know that was coming?
I honestly don't believe he did, because even after that incident, he still did a few prisoner watches. That was a lot of the overtime hours that he was constantly picking up, because he wasn't always having to do like armed guard security. There was a lot of, behind the desk watching security cameras, or, you know, doing security watch like in a parking lot, things like that. So they weren't all armed security, but a lot of times the prisoner watch was his overtime type.
Mm.
But
So,
other than knowing that they were going to slow him down, cut him back, as far as I know, he never indicated that he had any idea.
how do you think you would have taken that news if they would have eventually done that?
I think it would have been hard for him. He was very proud, and I think kind of in a way he would feel like he was letting the company down. But with other jobs, security wise, that he could do, like behind the desk and stuff like that, I mean, there was still plenty of work that he could do.
And maybe some of it wouldn't be as dangerous too, not having to come into such close physical contact with these prisoners, maybe.
Correct.
So let's move forward to June this year, or last year, excuse me, June 2022. Can you break down what happened that day and how things unfolded that led to this tragedy?
Yes. So on June 1st, I had woken up to a message on my phone from my dad saying that he had gone into work early to watch a prisoner. So the kids and I had still been asleep, just starting to wake up. And I had just had major back surgery a couple of months prior to this. So I was still in recovery and healing. And I was scrolling through Facebook, and I came across an article talking about a security guard had been shot at the hospital. And I knew that he had worked there many times. So, of course, I send a message and I'm like, hey, where are you working today? And I ended up kind of drifting off to sleep. And a couple of people were calling me and like blowing up my phone a little bit, but really didn't think nothing of it. I was, tired and still in a lot of pain from the back surgery. And was like, I'll just call him back later. And I hadn't heard anything back from my dad. But I really hadn't thought that he was involved in that, because I figured, the police or his job would have, called me. And that's none of the calls that I was getting. So phone kept going off. And finally, I answered. And the guy that I was with at that time just kind of blurted it out and said that your dad's dead. And at first, I was just like, it's not funny. And that's when I saw my oldest son pulling in, and then it hit me with the article, and I knew that he was gone. So all I remember is screaming and crying. My oldest son coming up, and he's screaming, he's crying. My two younger kids had no idea what was going on, but they were scared. And then they were finally told. And at that moment, for a little while, everything was just kind of a blur. I think it was just like in slow motion. And then a family called, and my cousin's a police officer up in that area, and he broke the news down to me as well. And I said that they were lying and didn't want to believe it. And that's when I started seeing like all the news articles on Facebook, and people started messaging me and showing up at the house. And about 3 hours after all this had taken place, and I first found out, our local police department walked up to my porch and handed me the phone, and it was the hospital morgue letting me know that my father was no longer with us. And of course, by this time I had already known. And I didn't know any other details other than he had been shot by a prisoner. Um, they hadn't released the prisoner's name yet, no other details. And that was pretty much it for that first day. I never talked to his place of work. I never talked to anybody from the hospital or the police department up in that area. I never heard anything from any of them, and just kind of learned a little bit more information as the days went on.
So this is the devastating news to get. Very tragic, and obviously it left you and your family devastated and shocked. Now you've got to, plan the funeral arrangements or memorial, whatever it was that you did afterwards. But then you also, I'm sure you had questions that you wanted to ask and figure out how could this happen. And I think it's a bit strange that the company wouldn't have the courtesy to reach out to you as fast as possible and say, hey, this tragic thing happened. And then also for the news to be reporting on it, but you hadn't even been told yet, just seems also kind of strange. How was it that, did they ever explain why you never got contacted?
Nope. Even to this day, I haven't heard anything really from his place of employment. They did come to his funeral services. A few of his coworkers, came up to me and was telling me, how much they were going to miss him and how dedicated he was, and all these, good things about him. But the main people that I felt should have came up never did.
Maybe some people that had answers and stuff like that.
His supervisors and things like that. They've been here. They've been to our cookouts, but he never, once came up to me and said anything. And as far as after the services, 6 months later, they had reached out to my dad's sister and said that they had his last pay stub and a letter from like the government, and asked for me to reach out to him. So I did. And it was just very short. He was telling me, hey, I've got his last pay stub check, and I've got this letter. I believe it was from the president. We had gotten a couple different ones, thanking him for his service and sending their condolences and things like that. But that was 6 months after his death. And I went up there, and they had actually gotten that presidential letter shortly after he was killed. And they had actually opened it, which I was a little upset about because it said to the family of Darrell Holderman. And I'm like, so why are they opening it? But after that, I've never heard anything else from them.
So obviously I'm assuming you wanted to get answers and figure out how this happened and all of that. What were you told officially when they came out with, the findings? What was the official story? How did this happen? How did this prisoner come to get your dad's gun and take his life before he ultimately took his own life?
A lot of that information I discovered through my own investigation, requiring my own, like police reports and the autopsy and different reports like that. I do know that the prisoner was there for detox reasons, is what I've been told. They said that he didn't seem violent. He seemed calm. They never suspected that he would do anything like this. The nurse that was taking care of the prisoner at that time said she had checked in on him 30 minutes prior to this incident happening, and he was handcuffed and shackled, and she'd given him some medication and was conversating with the both of them. And then around 9:45, 9:43, I believe, that's when the 911 calls and the police were notified of a possible shooting. I've also been told that the wrong code was sent out. So then they went in, and from what I understand, he had slipped out of the handcuffs, or that I was told that once the nurse got to that room, the prisoner was washing up at the sink and then ran out, and he had my dad's gun, and then went out from like the back of the emergency room all the way out through the front, out to the parking lot, where he apparently had my dad's cell phone and wallet as well, and kind of threw that over like the parking lot edge, and I guess dropped down to his knees or sat down and ended up taking his own life with my father's gun. And then he was rushed back in there, and they tried to save him, but he ended up passing. And eventually they rendered aid to my father, and unfortunately he wasn't able to make it. That's really all I was told through them. Never, how did he really get loose? How did he get out of the shackles? And, if if their room door was open and the lights were on when that nurse originally first left the room, but then when she had gone back, the door was closed and the lights were off. And I'm not sure exactly what time the attack actually took place, but he obviously had enough time to brutally beat my father and then shoot him and then start to wash up before anybody realized what was happening. But just from like the police statements and things like that and news reports, the room was destroyed. There was a lot of blood, and obviously they said my dad fought for his life. And I just don't understand to this day how such a struggle could take place in a hospital room and a gunshot, but nobody heard anything other than the time when the nurse that was in charge of the room said that she did hear somebody say, "Stop, that's enough, stop." And that was my dad. But according to the police report, she was at the desk charting when she heard that, but didn't get up to investigate it because she didn't know where it was coming from. And then it says a few minutes later, she went to the room, and that's when she saw my dad laying there, and the prisoner ran past her.
So it sounds like you really didn't get a lot of answers, and there were still questions. How did this happen? How could it have been prevented? Seems like you didn't get a lot of that.
Nope, I sure didn't. But once I got all the reports and started doing my own little investigation, because it just seemed like I wasn't getting any help from anybody else, they closed the police report and the investigation pretty much, because in their eyes, the victim and the suspect were both dead, and there's no cameras, obviously, in an ER hospital room. So they said we would never know what happened, or what really went down in that room that day. But then there was also said that there was a key that was left in the shackles, but nobody questioned where that key came from. And still to this day, I wonder that. I'm like, how did he get that key? And so through further investigation and stuff, and rewatching like news reports and the sheriff's reports, and learning that, one, he had picked up a shift. He wasn't even supposed to be there that day. He was going to go take my daughter to go buy her a TV, but he ended up picking up the shift, went in, and I do know that the prisoner had slipped out of the wrist cuffs, because he was only cuffed on one arm, and the only injuries to the prisoner indicated to me that he had actually slipped out. How he ended up getting the key for the shackles or getting loose from the shackles and actually overpowering my dad, I'll never know to this day. But I do know that my dad suffered a lot. He had multiple contusions to his head, his hands. I believe his neck was broken, and he had been brutalized so much in his head that it had actually left a golf ball size hole in his skull, and the actual bone from his skull actually penetrated into his brain. And he was shot in the back of his neck, and I guess the bullet went forward and down and came out his right hip, I believe. And according to the autopsy, multiple organs were damaged as the bullet went down. He suffered 3 cardiac arrests before he finally ended up passing. And like I said, the investigation was closed pretty much the same day. I had to go up to the police department 3 different times to get my dad's belongings. And when I had gotten his belongings, started going through them and looking at his keys, and his handcuff key was on his keychain, or set of keys. And I looked at his briefcase that he had taken with him, and he carried this thing everywhere. And there was a round medallion looking thing that had the security company's name on it. And I started to think, and I'm like, wait a minute. So of all things, when I went and got his personal effects, I was also given the shackles covered in my dad's blood with the key. And that was rough seeing that. But I'm looking at this key that was in evidence, and there's that round medallion, but yet I had my dad's key, and the round medallion was on his suitcase. So I can't be 100% sure that that wasn't his key, but I really, truly, to this day, don't believe that it was. So I always wondered, where did this key come from? Why didn't anybody ask or investigate? Like, I would think that they'd want to know that so they could prevent this from ever happening to somebody else. And I do know that there was another security guard from the same company that had my dad had relieved. So I was like, why didn't anybody ever question him or, get a statement from him or anything? And I'm not saying that the other guard was involved in any way, but did they check to make sure he still had his key? Because my dad was so by the books and so careful. It took his job so seriously. I just could never imagine him being irresponsible with the handcuff key to a prisoner. And he always kept his keys deep in his pocket anyway. And if it was my dad's handcuff key, the whole key set would have been in that shackle, in my opinion. Then I learned after watching a news conference from the sheriff's department that when the sheriff's department brought the prisoner to the hospital and then the security company took over, they had actually put on the handcuffs and shackles from the security company. So the sheriff's department took their handcuffs and shackles back with them, and the security company, I guess, had their own. So that tells me that the guard before my dad handcuffed and shackled the prisoner. So that just raised a lot of questions for me in that area. And then after getting some more evidence and hearing statements, I'm mind blown because I don't understand how nobody heard such a struggle going on in that room. And nobody mentioned the gunshot. They all said that it sounded like a wet floor sign. In the evidence with the police reports, two of the nurses both said that when they got, up to the room, they saw him laying there. One said that she saw him gasping for air, but they both said that the prisoner ran past them, but they were the only one there. So how did he run past two different nurses at two different times? Like, it just wasn't adding up. And then they said that, they went and got help, whatever, but why didn't they go in there right away and give my dad aid? It's like, I don't expect anybody to run to a shooter or anything and risk their life. But he was already out of the room and he was running and, taking off while my dad laid there. And just watching a lot of surveillance videos and things was super hard to watch. And hearing them say that, and hearing another nurse had gone into the room, picked up the bullet casing, showed it to everyone, and then put it back. Like, rule number 1, you don't touch evidence. And she went over to my dad and I guess lifted up his suit jacket that he always wore and discovered that his gun was gone. And that's when she told everybody that his gun was gone and there was a shooter. And then one nurse said that she thought he had just fell and nobody realized that he had actually been shot until a few minutes later. And that's when they started finally giving him aid, apparently. And then hearing from the news that there was the April incident with the mistaking of the prisoner, that was all new to me. I didn't know anything about that situation. So learning about that was hard. And then hearing a lot of different comments and stuff from people commenting on news stories and stuff like that. Like, what was a 78-year-old man doing security work and things like that. And it was hard. It hurt. And just, still in shock and trying to be strong and be there for my kids and trying to take all this in. Then I know that there was a OSHA investigation done, and that's when we had contacted a lawyer to possibly try to get some kind of justice for my dad. And it wasn't so much about winning a lawsuit or anything like that. It was, we didn't want another family to ever have to go through this because so many things had gone wrong that day and could have been prevented. And we just want changes. We want, something's got to be done because this should have never happened, ever.
So you're left with unanswered questions, and how hurtful was it that you had to read some of the things? It seems like they blamed him a little bit in some of the news reports, he just not long before he had this incident with this other prisoner where he, mistake the wrong prisoner for him, and it seemed like they blamed him. How tough was that to read and hear about?
It was very tough. I'm very defensive when it comes to my family, especially when I know that he wasn't at fault. Should he have been there that day? Absolutely not. But that was his job, and that's where they told him to go, and that's the job they told him to do that day, and that's what he did. But a lot of them were right. At 78, walking with a cane, he shouldn't have been there. And then as I learned more information through the OSHA report, it turns out that he had also had stage 4 cancer, and I had no idea. But yet his place of employment did. Once I got the OSHA report, I was told there was no citations with the security company when I talked to the OSHA investigator. Um, but there were changes that they did have to make. And he said pretty much, my dad was doing the job of a cop that day. Um, then I learned that, his place of employment with that security company, one of the supervisors made the comment that he takes full responsibility for, setting him there that day, that none of the other employees or coworkers knew anything about it. And I'm just like, well, if they didn't know anything about it, I guarantee nothing was ever said to my father. And then that's when I saw that they were well aware that he really wasn't capable of doing prisoner watch jobs anymore, as well as, having stage 4 cancer, which was another hard blow to learn that. And then knowing that they knew, but yet still put him in that situation. There's never been an I'm sorry or we messed up or anything. No, what can we do to help? Like, how can we help your family? There was nothing. It was just never another word.
You're left at the end of the day with unanswered questions, and you may not ever get answers to those questions. And it seems like a hole that's going to be there for you.
Oh, absolutely. We were hoping to try to get justice, and to be honest, it's going nowhere. I kept trying to reach out to the lawyers, and it just seemed like there was never any real answers. There was never anything. It felt like nothing was being done. And I know there's, a 2-year statute of limitations for like a wrongful death. And I felt like I was the one doing all the work on the investigation, getting all the reports, all the information, they needed. Just a year and 3 months later to be called in and pretty much like, oh, well, I don't even know if you guys have a case. And I'm like, that was just hard because it took you a year and 3 months, but yet I have all these reports where things went wrong. I feel like there should have been better communication between, the sheriff's department and the security company. And everybody's like, well, it was he said, she said. Well, how is it he said, she said, not taking him off prisoner watch when after the April incident, everybody was in agreement. So why was he sent there that day? Like it should have never happened. Nobody seems to want to own up to that.
So now you're left to deal with all of this, and again, not have any answers and try and figure out what happened. And none of it can bring your dad back, but so getting on with the grief, this has been now over a year. How's your family doing? How are they all holding up with the fact that he's been gone now this long?
Not good. It's just kind of been one day at a time. Been just trying to pick up the pieces. I know after he was killed, it pretty much broke me. I kind of shut down for a while, kind of gave up on a lot, and he was a part of my life. I'm 40 years old, and he was there every day. And it was always just me, Dad, and the kids. We don't have a whole, a very big family, and it was just pretty much us. And then after he was gone, I was scared, like what was going to happen to us, especially when it came to the house. I didn't know, are we going to have to move? Are we going to lose the house? I had so many questions about that, and I was trying to pick up all the pieces and, take over all the bills. And I had just gotten back to work from having major back surgery, and try to get back on my feet and trying to get justice for him, and making all these other discoveries about what went wrong that day, and being told that, well, they're not the ones who killed him. Well, I understand that, but they put him in that situation knowing. I was angry at the person that did it, but then I wondered, if he wasn't violent and they never thought he would do this, what made him do that? It left me with a lot of questions about that person and what caused him to become so violent that he did the amount of damage that he did to my dad, and then took his own life. I'm not giving up on getting my dad's story out there, trying to make changes, because I feel like this could have went so differently, and so many other things could have been done. Like, I think he only had like 20 hours training as an armed guard. He wasn't given proper training, in my opinion, to be able to do that kind of work. And my kids, they're pretty hurt. He was our provider, our hero, the backbone to our family. He was very involved in my kids' life. He was, kind of the role model and male figure in their life. And especially with my youngest son, he took it really hard. And he's still struggling to this day. He never really broke down and really grieved. He kind of held it all in, but it's hitting him now, and he's really having a hard time with that. And we're in the process of possibly losing our home now. So I'm not sure how that's going to go.
It sounds like there's a lot of fallout after this.
Yeah, most definitely.
And when it's not an easy road to go down and get past this, and my heart goes out to you and your family. So at the end here, is you're waiting to see what happens, is you're can't get justice because the person that did this can never be held accountable. So it sounds like at this point the only thing you can get is answers if they ever come. But at the end of the day, when people hear about your dad and they think about your dad, what do you want them to remember your dad for and think about when they think about your dad?
Just the kind of man that he was. He had such a big heart, and after he was, killed, so many people, when I would go out, and they would be like, "Cowboy." That's what he was known as, was Cowboy, because he always wore this black cowboy hat. And I'd go up to like the courts or the police department for like the evidence, and they'd be like, "We're so sorry for your loss. I do, Cowboy. He was such a great man, and kind heart, always willing to go above and beyond for anybody." And it was eye-opening and amazing, honestly, because we always knew him as working nonstop or being here, but to learn just how many lives he had actually touched, it's still mind-blowing even to this day. And it's like, we still have people coming up to us and be like, "Cowboy," and I'm like, I had no idea that he had touched that many lives. But just want him to be remembered as the family man that he was, the hard worker, and just how important family really is. And then, I hope people take his story and what happened and kind of open their eyes and treasure what family they have and what time that they have, and make every moment count, and just live and be kind.
Because you never know when something like this tragedy could happen to them. Well, I want to thank you for coming on to share your father's story with us, and Again, I know this has been tough on your family, and I hope that you are able to get through this together and deal with everything that you've had to go through since this happened.
Yeah, I'm just hoping, changes are made. Like, I'll never stop. I'll keep fighting to make changes happen to the best of my ability, because I had just recently learned that another incident had actually happened to another guard over this past weekend. And I just hope that maybe it'll open this company's eyes that something's got to be done.
Yeah, definitely, to prevent something like this from happening again.
Hmm.
Well, thank you so much for coming on. And again, I hope that you and your family are able to get through this the best that you can.
I appreciate it.
Thank you once again for joining me for this episode of The Murder of My Family. I'd like to thank Sonny Landon for writing and research assistance in this episode. We'll be back here soon with an all-new episode of The Murder of My Family, and I hope you'll join me for it. But before you go, remember that every murder victim means something to somebody.